The changes in the education sector, the way we assess students, the rise of digitalization and artificial intelligence, the changes in the learning environment, and many other unusual and controversial questions. We will be examining them one after the other in this channel. My name is Daniel Wiśniewski, and this is Education Chapter. Welcome to Education Charter. My name is Daniel Wiśniewski, and I am here with Professor Peter Levine from Tufts University from Boston, actually from Boston area. Peter, thank you very much for accepting the invitation and joining us at Education Charter.
I'm so glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Peter, we met here in order to talk about civic education, and I think this couldn't be it's probably the most timely discussion that we could actually have. We have all kinds of important elections coming up. In the United States, we are in the times of primaries. In the European Union and in Europe in general, we have elections coming up either this year, next year, and well, it seems we are going for a political change. Now, we sort of think, well, that all these changes might have been a result of what? Why is that so that people started voting in certain ways and we are so afraid of? And what is the role of the education sector in it? Is there something education can do for the people to be able to vote, to make an informed choice? And on the one hand, we had the economic crisis. We had the liberal democracy, in my view, is in decay in many countries. We have an increasing polarization, and we have the social media, which actually tend to be making more bubbles and keeping us into information bubbles that we are all in, as they have all kinds of algorithms that guide the videos of similar content to us. What can education do about it? Is there something we can really do?
Yeah, I think you're right about the diagnosis, and I think education and specifically civic education can be helpful. I definitely don't think it solves all the problems. You just gave a lot of different causes, and we can't get out of a lot of crises just through our civic education. But I think we can make a difference. I mean, one of the causes that you mentioned was media bubbles and social media, and you can directly teach young people to get out of their bubble. I mean, you can have assignments in classes that are about looking at multiple news sources and comparing and contrasting. So, I don't think news media bubbling is the only problem facing democracy, but I think it's one of them, and we could address that one. So I think our conversation probably should be about how civic education can help, but not how it's the solution to everything.
If we cannot solve it, okay, of course, I mean, we cannot solve the fact that we have a decline in the number of people from the middle class, and that might be an impoverishment of certain people. But you're right, we could actually help as education sector to, well, improve the media literacy, at least.
Yeah.
We are all bombarded with news. And in fact, we don't know the sources. We don't, and one thing that's, at least is my personal view, is that journalism has become much more about narrative than it is about fact. That might be a strong statement, but that's my belief. Is there something that we could raise awareness of the children or young adults to be able to judge things by themselves?
Yeah. I mean, I think I am very interested in Europe, but I'll say from an American perspective, a U.S. perspective, it's traditional actually to teach young people to read the news. But the world has changed. The news has changed so much. So the traditional pedagogy, essentially, going back to the early 20th century, was that you would assign the students to read the city newspaper or the most respectable sort of mainstream city newspaper, and they would have to understand it. And you'd even give them a test on the news to see if they'd done the reading, or ask them to bring a news story that was interesting to them. I mention this because now we don't have the city newspaper. I mean, they're collapsing. many of them are bankrupt. Even right now, in the headlines are stories about how both San Francisco and Baltimore, two great big old American cities, may be losing their newspaper. And we have the whole social media landscape. So you can't do the traditional way of teaching how to be news literate. So you have to teach students how to do things like decide whether to click through when they see a link on a social media platform. It's a very different, and whether to share what they've seen, because they also are more empowered young people in some ways, because they're the ones who are deciding what gets shared. And so you have a really different educational challenge. I think a more difficult one. The old one was helping students actually understand, because newspaper articles are written in a kind of a funny way. They usually expect a lot of background knowledge. And so the traditional thing was just teaching a student how to understand an article, a professionally written news article. But now that's out the window. Now the question is, do you believe this thing that you're being told? How do you figure out where it came from? And there's lots of fakery. And I would also, on the bright side, there's direct access to tremendously good information if a student is so motivated and knows how to do it. So back in the old days, you had to count on the newspaper to give you the information, but now you probably can get really good information yourself. And in some ways that's great, but it's a whole different set of skills. Mm-hmm. So the burden on the schools in some ways has gone up.
It's actually paradoxical, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, we have much more information, and again, like 10 years ago, when Twitter, today is called differently, but back then it was Twitter, showed up, I was convinced that it actually improved democracy. Why is that so? Well, I thought this will somehow, enhance the public debate, because right now, anyone can actually participate in that discussion. So it sort of brought democracy to lower levels, to people that normally were not part of it, or they were not involved in it. So it sort of enhanced it. Today, I would not be able to defend that claim, or I would probably switch my claim. I would say, well, it also led to much more polarization. And it actually makes especially young people vulnerable to all kinds of misleading information. So the question is, how do you teach civic education? Is there, how can you really do that? Is this just about media literacy, or is it something more than that?
No, I meant media literacy as an example, although it is a pretty important one. But first of all, civic education can be quite a broad category. For example, when you're learning about the history of your own country or about the world, that's contributing to your ability to navigate the current world. So the whole history curriculum, which usually in most countries takes a lot more time and many more resources are devoted to that than to what's officially called civics. But all of history could be seen as civic. I mean, actually, other things, when you learn statistics and mathematics, you're learning something that's essential to being effective as a citizen. So in some ways, you could almost say the entire curriculum is civic. But it's very hard to really declare that anything is completely not. Again, it's helpful to know chemistry and physics in order to understand climate change and so on. But usually if there's a civic education curriculum, or sometimes it's called something different like citizenship or political education or something, it emphasizes kind of the official structures of our political order, right? It emphasizes the Constitution or its equivalent, the way that the government works, who can vote in an election and what can you vote for, and I think that's important. I mean, it's a with very little of that knowledge. If you have very little of that knowledge, you really can't participate, right? We ask, why do people vote, and one thing is they have to know that there's an election and what it's about and who's getting elected. So I think that kind of understanding of the system is important. And then we learn a bunch of skills. Maybe we don't learn the right skills in most of our schools, but I would emphasize things like skills of deliberation. So how do you talk to people about what we should do? And also skills of organizing and building associations. I mean, the sort of patron philosopher of the United States is Alexis de Tocqueville, and he says that we're the people who know how to make associations. But I mean, he's right, but it's also true that all human beings make associations, and our ability to do this declined. So I don't think it's just an American thing to learn how to make and form groups and get them to work. And that would be, for me, a very important part of civic education.
Okay, that's all right. I'm going to be controversial here. I'm going to try to ask you some questions that, imagine the question here is, it's pretty simple. Can we then teach certain political stance to children? Or is it that we should just focus on you need to be able to make your own mind, and therefore you should take a look at different parts or different sides of the coin or different political views to make up your own mind? So is the purpose of civic education empowering people to make up their own mind about their political views? Or is it about, and some critiques of civic education would claim, well, to give them certain political stance? I don't know that I'm sure you should be I don't know, pro something or against something, or you should be doing certain things because if not, you're actually an outsider. The question is it about empowering people so they can make up their own mind, or is it rather is it rather to simply tell that certain things are okay and others not, and who decides about values that
Yeah, that's a really good questions. I like the questions. This is obviously one of the places where there's a debate. I mean, there's a kind of, I would say, classically liberal conception which says, don't propagandize at all, don't overly influence. You're trying to, the root of liberal is freedom. You're trying to give the individual student the opportunity to form their own opinions. One critique of that, for one thing, that is actually got a politics to it. It's liberal politics, and so right there, you're not neutral. You're actually, for example, anti-fascist, because that kind of education is probably incompatible with fascism, and so right there, you've got a view. And then one could say actually you should have more commitments than that. That, for example, you should be explicitly for certain kinds of values, which might be constitutional values in a given context. I'm very moved by the first sentence of the German Basic Law. Human dignity is inviolable. That's English, obviously, but that's how I would translate it. But I mean, you could imagine that in Germany, students should be taught not only about that, but that to believe it, that actually here human dignity is inviolable, and that would be something I would be comfortable if people said that. So there's a question of how much to build in. I don't think anybody believes in general that, the purpose of civic education is to have students vote more right or more left within, or more Christian Democrat versus secular within the context of a functioning democracy. That they're supposed to make up their own mind about that. The harder part comes along when you have political parties that are pretty influential that don't agree with the core constitutional values, because then you are biased. You should be biased against them.
So in other words, we should, you see, the thing is, again, with the civic education, even if you would like to teach in whatever context civic education, you need to have some underlying values that you want to give to those children or to those young adults. Because otherwise, I mean, if you don't have those, on what you will be basing this civic education? The state of, I don't know, anarchy, I mean, or I don't know, it's like we always, in any kind of society, we are building certain laws. It can be a rule of law, for instance. It could be democracy. It could be human dignity, you said. However you would define it, because in every country is defined differently. It could be respect for human rights. It could be whatever. So in a certain way, you always, within the scope of civic education, you will be kind of portraying certain values, because otherwise it simply makes no sense. But then there's people that deny those. Why? Because we live in multicultural societies,
Mhm.
Therefore, we sort of, well, we cannot, and can we really expect that all these people will respect those? There would be
Mhm.
Muslims who, I don't know, they could be, I don't know, they could have certain political views. They could be Christians that have other political views. They could be, I don't know, people living in certain minorities, homosexuals, who would have certain political views. How can we really, so I'm leading to this question, how can we really teach civic education uh, with such a fragmented and often and multicultural society?
Yeah. So one thing is to to the diversity of people is not a problem. At least I don't think it's a problem, and I think there's a sort of mainstream political philosophy of the United States which says it's beneficial. And so the diversity of people is also the fact that civic education is contested seems to me perfectly natural because it does affect the future of our country. And so if people care and they're different, they will argue about it. The kind of groups you listed are not the ones that worry me. The kind of people who worry me are the ones who don't like those groups. Right. So it's not, I mean, Muslims aren't a threat to democracy in the United States. Anti-Muslims are. People who hate Muslims are. I mean, it's partly just a matter of numbers.
Mhm.
But anyway, but some degree of debate and controversy is doesn't worry me, doesn't alarm me. It actually seems like a natural thing that the democracy should debate this. Well, you did ask a few minutes ago, but we didn't follow this thread. Who decides? And that's a very literal question. Who actually does decide? And this is I think almost every country has some balance between sort of one national decision versus a lot of decentralized decisions. France is famous for one national decision. But for example, some countries have a national textbook about history or about civics. The U.S. definitely doesn't. We have a purely commercial market with a lot of textbook publishers who produce competing titles, and people buy them. Generally speaking.
So you don't have one. You said history is actually part of civic education. So you say you have a commercially driven sales of all kinds of history books and handbooks. But the question is, well, of course, everybody has it. Every country has its own historiography. So it has its own vision of what our nation is. I mean, every country has it. I don't know. And normally it's actually, I'm not going to be making jokes about this because it's a sensitive topic, but I mean, there are certain, in many countries, we actually kind of distinguish ourselves vis-a-vis the neighbor, really.
Right.
And that happens in even democratic countries, non-democratic countries. And so why we are this? Because we are not them. So every country has its own historiography, right? So there is a certain decision of what kind of civic education we do. And you said diversity is fine. I think diversity is actually very enriching, it's true. The question is, to what extent does it, and I think it's a valid question, does it really make the society, I don't know, or teaching civic education easier or more complex? And yeah, ultimately we would have to find those common denominators, don't we?
Yeah. There's a question about how common, we have to be, how much we are aiming for everybody to be more similar or not. That's obviously a contested question, but there's also just the question of how much variation you're willing to tolerate. I mean, I also think a lot of European countries are comfortable with sort of different decisions being made at the school level, and even having schools with Christian or Islamic or other kinds of although usually with some kind of layer of this is what the state expects. In the US, we have this highly decentralized system, and we also have what I think is unique, a lot of literal politics about schools. So schools are normally governed by school boards, local school boards, and they are elected. And so there's a lot of intense politics about what's taught in the individual schools, which is involves a lot of people. There are thousands and thousands of people who are elected to school boards, and they're also highly localized. So you end up with a very different civic education in a conservative part of the country versus a liberal part of the country. And then on top of that, a layer of it's also a marketplace, because at the end of the day, they're going to buy things like books and other things, not just books, video and stuff, but they're going to buy materials, and those get sold. And not only by for-profit companies, but also by nonprofits. And some of them some things are free, but it's still a market, right? So it's quite complicated. I mean, it really is, and it's more complicated than a typical European policy, because we don't have the national government Department of Education does not really have a civic education policy.
That's interesting.
And would be opposed if it had one. If that would be very controversial, and it would be seen as a threat to local control.
Right. I see. In fact, in Europe, we do have these debates. It's like whatever government is in power, this government can somehow change or shift or change the flavor of civic education. But there are certain values, like, I don't know, respect for common good, respect for human dignity, respect for human rights, respect for democracy, rule of law, and so on, that I think we, at least at the European level, we try to defend those, right?
Yeah.
Yet they are contested, of course. They are really contested nowadays in this quite shaky times that we have the privilege of living. Okay, we talked a little bit.
I'll just mention one quick thing, which is there is an advantage to decentralization, which is that the powerful new political entity can't change things very much. So, I mean, Donald Trump had no effect whatsoever on the curriculum of American students.
Right.
Zero. I mean, he issued a well-known sort of edict to a presidential order, but it's not relevant. And it's because it's not really a federal national government function. And so I think that is a kind of it's a obstacle to change. So if you think things should be changed, it's frustrating, but it does prevent bad change.
Ultimately, the school belongs into the hands of the local community, isn't it, in the United States? And
the state, there's a state versus local tension, but definitely not the national. So some states are kind of aligned with Trump on what he believes, and some states are extremely opposed, like mine. And he had no influence on our curriculum.
I see. Okay. So we talked a little bit about why we teach it, and whether we should teach it, and we spoke a little bit about the controversy around it, whether we could consider it indoctrination. I don't know. Again, we kind of touched upon this, but now the question is how to do it. Is this, when do you said, okay, history class is actually a civic education element. So when do you really do this? When children are able to grasp, well, their civic responsibilities, obligations, and rights. Do they? And how would you do this? In what sense? And then again, in America is different than in Europe, but how would you do that in a methodological way?
Yeah. Well, I do think it's I'm afraid I would include a lot of ages and a lot of settings. So I mean, I do think it starts with little 5-year-olds for whom the questions are mostly about how do we envision a community, how do we think of the classroom as a community, how do we relate to other people fairly, a little bit of a sense of that they are part of a community and a nation and a world, and it works all the way up to the last years of secondary education, where it's much more intellectual, and you're thinking about how does the EU work or whatever. But it doesn't stop there. I just want to say civic education for adults, whether they go to university or not, is very important. It's a weakness in the US. There's an ironic story, because when the US occupied a substantial part of Germany after World War II, we helped some good Germans and other Europeans to create an adult education system in Germany that persists to this day, which I admire a lot. And the reason we did that was because we said, well, they were Nazis and we need to denazify. We never did anything like that in the US, partly because we didn't take the view that there was such a problem. But as a result, they have a very robust adult, voluntary adult democratic education system, and we don't have that at all. So I don't think it should stop when you turn 19 or 20. In the US, also, universities are actively part of this, and I think that's less true in Europe for various reasons I could get into. But anyway, but it's the whole 13 years at least of K, what we call kindergarten to 12th grade education. And then the other thing about how is, well, I will say this: there's a risk that civic education is especially boring because if it's about the intricacies of how government works, it really is kind of boring. And the problem with that, it's a real problem, because I'm convinced that what happens is people forget it. We have this kind of funny debate in the US that recurs all my life, where there'll be some survey of adults, and the adults in the survey perform very badly on knowledge. They don't know what the Congress says. So it's a big alarm, and everybody says, we need to start teaching this in school. And after a while, they may figure out that we have been teaching it in school, because we have. It's true. People have studied this, and they had to pass a test on it, but they don't know it when they're adults. Why? And I think the answer is because it was really, really boring. So they managed to get through the test, and then they forgot it because it didn't interest them. And you don't need to know this kind of things, like how does the government work, for your regular life as an adult. So one of the most important things is actually to make people think it's interesting, and that does really imply more engaging pedagogies. I know it sounds like kind of a cliche, we need to make education interesting, but I think it really, really is true for civics, because we've tried the other, which is telling everybody this is what the parliament does, and this is who the chancellor is, or the president, or whatever, and they forget it with remarkably high rate. Forget it, because it was just not something that they understood why they were learning it. So things like debates and student-generated projects to study issues and creating cultural artifacts and these kinds of things are better than getting lectured about how the government works.
You said, I mean, in one of the previous episodes of this education chapter, I had the pleasure of speaking with a gentleman from Portugal, and he told me, Rodrigo Melo, for our viewers, if you would like to see that, we are actually talking about Portuguese system, but we touched upon PISA results, and we talked a little bit about the reasons why we did so bad in PISA in Europe. And actually, Rodrigo made an interesting claim there that one of the reasons is, well, COVID, of course, contributed to it, but the trends in PISA and the lower result than expected have started before COVID. And he was making a claim that in fact, this is because education has become boring to the younger generation. We sort of, with all those pupils and kids and young adults being exposed to so much information using the social media and stuff like this, it's sort of obsolete, and we need to look into new learning environments to catch their attention. That was his statement. I think that this really refers to what you're trying to say about civic education. In the past, I remember, I don't know if it's still the case, but I remember that it was the American nationalism, let's call it this way. So the fact that you would sing your national anthem in the positive sense. You would sing your national anthem in the school, and the kids know how to behave. This kind of commitment to the military forces, which I experienced when I lived in the US. It's something that is quite unique. In Europe, it's actually not that. I think it's non-existent. It's slightly different. And yet, it also leads to this greater polarization, the involvement of Americans in politics, and the debate is I think, even much more heated than in many European countries. What would be your opinion on this? Is this a positive development, or is that something that we should also try to address through civic education? On top of my head, I would say being participatory in democracy, even in a heated debate, is better than not being participatory.
Yeah.
But at the same time, maybe it's going to the extreme. Like last time when Trump was president, there was people attacking the Congress.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think that some degree of debate and controversy is actually good. It's a sign that we've woken up and we care, and and we're different, we disagree, that's okay. I think when I was talking before about how heterogeneous and local American civic education is, I might be a little misleading because, of course, we have a culture, and you experienced it living in the U.S. And a European coming in and looking into all of the textbooks and things would often say, well, these have a certain flavor, which is not being imposed really by the government. It's a cultural thing. And so, for example, you're right. They're going to be more. They're going to be nationalistic in a certain way and more favorable to the military than often we'd see in Europe. And I think those are not to be explained by some policy decision, but more by the public opinion. The other thing that's happened is the U.S. has more aggressively questioned some of the traditional elements of the mainstream culture. So, for instance, we are having a very deep and, in many ways, very valuably profound debate about the role of slavery and race in American life. But that changes the textbooks and things. When I was young in the 1980s, and in the north of the United States, which is the part that was fought the Civil War against slavery, our textbooks still depicted slavery as not very bad, and they were actually wrong. I mean, I think they're demonstrably factually wrong, and those things have changed. But the change tends to be through culture, not through politics. But anyway, I am answering your question because I think what we see in the United States is very intense feelings about the national narrative, that where more is being debated. I mean, for example, the word patriotism is a very contested word. There are a lot of more liberal places where you wouldn't use that as a positive word at all, and there are more conservative places where you would think it was absolutely core and basic. And I think I don't
in Europe
see...
as well. In Europe as well, you would have certain countries where the word patriotic would have negative connotation. It wouldn't be something positive.
Close to sort of restrictive nationalism rather than sort of love of community.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's partly a terminology and what the word resonates with. But I think we do have a wider range of expressed opinions and more heat around this. It's almost religion. There's this idea of the American civic religion, which goes back to the idea goes back to the 1960s, that there's a kind of set of beliefs that have that a religious feel. Among other things, they are a bit like a biblical narrative because there are sort of prophets like the framing founding fathers, and there are there's a sacrificial figure who's Abraham Lincoln, and it's like the New Testament, and there's scripture, which is the Constitution. And so this idea that there's a shared civic religion, and the thing is, that's therefore, because it's a religion, it's full of passion and commitment, but it's also being challenged by basically people who are heretics to that religion in the present moment, including me. I don't subscribe to the traditional religion. I think it's just wrong in some ways. So that's causing a tremendous level of tension.
And it's actually quite interesting because coming back to the aims, because ultimately civic education has to have an underlying aim, right? It could, it could involve respect for being a global citizen, or respect for environment. It could be respect for democracy. It has to have certain aim. But then, can civic education actually produce unintended consequences? Like, people are being taught patriotism. They understand patriotism in a certain way that may lead them to vote for certain groups that could be extreme. I don't know. So again, it's also about defining the aim. And as you said, in a decentralized system like in the United States, every community could decide on its own. In Europe, it's mostly national politics that decides this. And when we talk about civic education, we mean things like rule of law. We mean like democracy. We mean human rights. We mean this is what we mean. And then all those people who would kind of contest those, they would say that's not civic education at all.
Well, and we do have to be careful about. So I believe that democratic governments should provide civic education, and that they should do so in an accountable way and say this is what we're providing. you, the people, can decide whether we're doing it right. I think that's part of democracy. But we do have to be careful because public, state-sponsored civic education is the state teaching people what to think about the state. And so there's definitely a risk of it being propagandistic in a way that protects the state. And we quickly see that with authoritarian regimes. I've been actually watching through translations. I can't read Russian, but I've been watching some of the changes in the curriculum in Russia since the Ukraine war. And they have these actual lessons, scripted lessons, which are pro-Ukraine war. And, they're absolutely horrifying. But they also, from my perspective, but they also remind us that all of our governments produce the materials that the kids have to study. So we need to be careful. We need to be vigilant and make sure that they're not the government isn't serving the government's interests, but that the people are getting educated. But on the other hand, to not do it at all means allowing lots of people to not even know how to participate, and then they can't be part of democracy. So it's tough. But I think it's always good to be a bit skeptical.
I think, one thing that I'm a parent myself. One thing I really would like to teach to my kids probably is the healthy dose of skepticism of whatever they read or see or observe, because after all, those people that have this kind of virtue, normally they are able to see they can distinguish what's propaganda, what's ideology, what's not, and kind of, later on you can actually go through and see get to the truth, more or less, isn't it? But anyway,
yeah, we try.
Isn't it?
We try.
Can try, isn't it? Thanks a lot, Pete, for this. I think that indeed, the civic education is a controversial topic. Why? It's not a controversial topic, but it might be a little bit of a controversial questions around it, simply because there are people that would contest this. They would say it's indoctrination. Thanks a lot for not being afraid of these questions and trying to answer those. Again, we live in times of polarization. Everybody has its own opinion and consider its opinion as truth. And how can we really teach civic education in the times like that? But certainly we try. We try to protect and empower people to do this. And now I'm gonna just direct to our viewers the questions of this episode. What do you think about this? Do we need civic education or not? Is this useful? Is this really, is this actually empowering kids to be active citizens, or it's actually indoctrination? Let us know what you think about this. If you like this material, give us a subscription and a like. This allows it to be viral and to kind of reach a wider group of audience, which I always recommend. Thank you very much for all your time, and thank you, Pete, for your time for
Thank you for having me
with us. Staying tuned at Education Chapter. All the best.
Thank you.